"You're just a guest here now," my daughter-in-law said with a faint smile as I stepped into the lawyer's office to hear my husband's will being read, and for a brief moment, I truly believed she might be right. I remember the way the room smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee that had been sitting too long, the kind of quiet, professional space where lives were reduced to signatures and documents. My son Daniel stood near the window, his back half turned toward me, staring out as if something outside mattered more than what was about to unfold inside that room. Vanessa sat confidently at the table, her posture perfect, her fingers lightly resting on a leather folder that I didn't recognize. She didn't greet me. She didn't need to. The message was already clear in the way she looked at me, as though I were someone who had overstayed her welcome in a place that used to be her home. I took my seat slowly, smoothing my coat over my knees, the same navy coat Edward had bought me last winter because he said it made me look elegant without trying too hard. That memory flickered through my mind, soft and warm, and then it was gone, replaced by the cold awareness that he was no longer here to say things like that. Mr. Collins cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, his eyes briefly meeting mine with something that felt almost like hesitation, though I couldn't be sure. Vanessa leaned slightly toward Daniel and whispered something that made him nod without looking at me, and I realized then that whatever was about to happen had already been decided in conversations I was never part of. For a long time, I had believed that grief would be the hardest part of losing my husband, that waking up to an empty bed and a silent house would be the deepest kind of pain I could feel. But sitting there, in that room, surrounded by people who shared my name but not my loyalty, I began to understand that grief was only the beginning. Vanessa finally turned her attention to me, her lips curling just enough to suggest amusement rather than kindness. "I hope you're prepared for what comes next," she said lightly, as if we were discussing the weather instead of the life Edward and I had built over 42 years. I met her gaze, steady and calm, and for the first time since I walked into that room, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. Not because I agreed with her, and not because I was unaware of the game she thought she was playing, but because I had learned something over the years that Vanessa had not yet discovered. Silence can be mistaken for weakness, especially by those who have never needed it to survive. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and waited as Mr. Collins opened the file in front of him, the sound of paper shifting echoing softly in the room. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, confident, certain, already celebrating a victory that had not yet been announced. Daniel exhaled slowly, still avoiding my eyes. And I sat there, composed and patient, letting them believe whatever they needed to believe, because the truth has a way of arriving exactly when it's supposed to, and when it does, it doesn't need anyone to raise their voice to be heard. The memory of that room did not begin with the will being opened. It began 3 mornings earlier, when the house felt too quiet even for grief, when the sunlight slipped through the kitchen blinds and landed on a table set for 1 instead of 2. And for a long moment, I stood there holding a coffee cup I had poured out of habit, staring at the empty chair across from me as if Edward might walk in and gently remind me that I was overthinking things again. The silence had a different weight that morning, not just the absence of his voice, but the absence of something else I could not yet name, something that had shifted quietly beneath the surface of my family. Daniel had stopped calling as often, his messages shorter, more practical, as if our conversations had become items on a checklist rather than moments shared between a son and his mother. Vanessa, on the other hand, had suddenly become attentive in a way that felt rehearsed, offering to help organize paperwork and asking questions about accounts and documents that Edward had always handled himself. At the time, I told myself it was kindness, that she was trying to step up in a difficult moment, but there was something in her tone, something too polished, too precise, like someone reading from a script they had memorized long before the performance began. That morning, I walked through the house slowly, my hand brushing against the back of chairs, the edge of the hallway table, the familiar surfaces that had held our life together for decades, and I noticed small changes that I had overlooked before. A drawer in Edward's study that did not close quite the same way. A folder missing from the stack he kept neatly arranged beside his desk. Even the safe in the closet, which I rarely touched, had been slightly repositioned, just enough that someone who did not know it as well as I did might not notice, but I did. I stood there for a long time, my fingers resting lightly against the cold metal, and I felt it then, Not fear, not anger, but clarity beginning to take shape, slow and steady. Later that afternoon, I found an envelope tucked between a set of documents that Vanessa had insisted on organizing the day before, an envelope I knew I had not placed there myself. It was sealed, unmarked, but the weight of it felt intentional, as though it had been left for me to find at exactly the right moment. I did not open it right away. Instead, I placed it on the kitchen counter and went about the rest of my day as if nothing had changed, as if the world was still what I had believed it to be just a week earlier. I prepared dinner, though I did not feel hungry, and I sat at the table across from that empty chair again, letting the quiet settle around me like a second skin. When I finally opened the envelope that evening, the paper inside was crisp, official, unmistakable in its tone, and as I read through the words carefully, more than once, I felt that same calm settle deeper into my chest, replacing the uncertainty that had followed me since Edward's passing. It was not a surprise, not entirely, because Edward had always been a careful man, the kind who planned for possibilities others preferred to ignore. But it was the confirmation I needed, the quiet assurance that not everything had been left to chance, not everything had been placed in the hands of those who mistook control for loyalty. By the time I folded the paper and slipped it back into the envelope, I understood something important. Whatever Vanessa believed she had secured, whatever version of the future she had already begun to imagine, it was built on an assumption that had not yet been tested. And I had no intention of correcting her. Not yet. By the time I finished reading the document that evening, I did not feel shock, and I did not feel relief. What I felt was recognition, as though I had finally been handed the missing piece to a puzzle I had been quietly assembling without realizing it. Edward had always believed in preparation, not fear, but preparation, and as I sat there at the kitchen table with the envelope resting beside my untouched dinner, I could almost hear his voice reminding me that people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe no one is paying attention. Over the next 2 days, I paid attention. I noticed the way Vanessa moved through the house with a confidence that had not been there before, opening cabinets without asking, sorting through drawers with the casual entitlement of someone who believed everything she touched already belonged to her. She spoke to Daniel in low, measured tones when she thought I was out of earshot, her words carefully chosen, her pauses deliberate, like someone guiding a conversation toward a conclusion she had already decided. Daniel followed her lead in small ways that might have gone unnoticed before, deferring to her on details he would once have discussed with me, avoiding my gaze when I entered a room, answering my questions with half-finished sentences that left more unsaid than spoken. It was not hostility, not exactly. It was something quieter, something more calculated, the slow redirection of loyalty away from me and toward a future where I no longer fit. On the second evening, Vanessa suggested that we all meet at Mr. Collins' office to get everything finalized, her tone light but firm, as if the decision had already been made and all that remained was my agreement. I nodded without hesitation, offering a small smile that seemed to reassure her more than any words could have, and I saw it then, the brief flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, the kind that comes when a plan appears to be unfolding exactly as intended. That night, I returned to Edward's study, standing in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. The scent of his cologne still faintly lingering in the air, grounding me in a way nothing else had since he was gone. I opened the drawer that no longer closed quite right and found what I expected to find, the subtle signs of someone searching for something they had not fully understood. Papers shifted just enough to suggest curiosity, not care. I placed everything back exactly as it should be, my movements slow and deliberate, not to hide what had happened, but to acknowledge it without reacting. The envelope remained where I had left it, tucked safely out of sight, not because I was afraid it might be taken, but because I understood its value was not in being hidden, but in being revealed at the right moment. The following morning, I dressed carefully, choosing the navy coat once again, smoothing my hair with the same attention I had given to countless family gatherings over the years, not out of habit, but out of intention. When Daniel arrived to pick me up, he lingered by the door as though unsure how to begin a conversation that no longer came naturally, and Vanessa stood just behind him, her expression composed, her confidence intact. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice carrying that same quiet certainty. I looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the calm assurance, the belief that she had already secured her place in a future she had helped design, and I nodded. Yes, I said simply, because readiness, I had learned, does not come from knowing what others expect. It comes from understanding what they do not see coming. And as we walked toward the car together, I allowed them both to move ahead of me, not because I was following, but because sometimes the clearest view of what lies ahead comes from watching those who believe they are leading. The drive to Mr. Collins' office was quiet, but it was not the kind of quiet that comes from comfort. It was the kind that settles in when too many things have already been said elsewhere, behind closed doors, in conversations that were never meant for me to hear. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel, his posture stiff, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if any glance in my direction might force him to acknowledge something he was not ready to face. Vanessa sat beside him, her body relaxed, one hand resting lightly on her purse, the other tapping softly against her knee in a rhythm that felt almost impatient, as though she were waiting for something inevitable to finally arrive. I watched them from the back seat, not with suspicion, not with anger, but with a kind of clarity that made everything seem sharper, more defined, like the moment before a storm breaks when the air feels heavier but the sky remains deceptively calm. When we arrived, Vanessa stepped out first, smoothing her coat as she walked toward the building entrance with the quiet confidence of someone who believed she belonged at the center of whatever was about to happen. Daniel hesitated for just a second before following her, and then he turned back to open my door, offering a small, almost automatic gesture that might have meant something once, but now felt like an echo of a habit rather than a reflection of intention. I stepped out slowly, adjusting my coat, taking in the familiar exterior of the office building where Edward and I had once come together years ago, back when decisions like these were made side by side, not in quiet opposition. As we walked inside, the receptionist greeted us politely, her smile professional and neutral, unaware of the tension that moved with us like a shadow. Vanessa spoke first, her voice clear and composed as she confirmed our appointment, and I noticed the way she positioned herself slightly ahead of Daniel, not by accident, but by design, as though she had already stepped into a role she believed was hers to claim. We were led into the same room I had imagined over the past 2 days, the same polished table, the same neatly arranged chairs, the same quiet hum of an office that had witnessed countless endings disguised as new beginnings. Mr. Collins was already there, standing beside the table with a folder in his hands, and when his eyes met mine, there was that same brief pause, that same flicker of something unspoken, quickly masked behind professionalism. Vanessa took her seat without hesitation, placing her purse carefully beside her and folding her hands as if she were preparing for a meeting she had already rehearsed in her mind. Daniel sat beside her, his movements slower, less certain, and I could see the tension in the way his shoulders remained slightly raised, as though he were bracing for something he could not quite name. I chose my seat deliberately, not at the far end of the table as I might have before, but closer, within clear view of everyone in the room, not to assert anything, but simply to be present in a way that could not be overlooked. As Mr. Collins began to speak, outlining the process in calm, measured tones, I let my gaze move briefly across the room, taking in every detail, the placement of the documents, the careful order of the pages, the way Vanessa's eyes remained fixed on the folder as if she were already reading what had not yet been said aloud. There was a moment, just a brief one, when Daniel shifted in his seat and glanced toward me, and in that instant, I saw something familiar in his expression, not confidence, not certainty, but doubt, quiet and fleeting, like a thought he had not yet allowed himself to fully consider. And then it was gone, replaced once again by the careful distance he had maintained since the day everything began to change. I folded my hands in my lap, steady and still, and waited, not because I was uncertain of what would come next, but because I understood that timing, more than anything else, determines how truth is received, and in that room, surrounded by people who believe they already knew the outcome, the most powerful thing I could do was nothing at all. Mr. Collins opened the folder slowly, not with hesitation but with the kind of deliberate care that comes from understanding the weight of what is about to be said, and for a moment, no one spoke, not even Vanessa, whose confidence had carried her effortlessly through every step leading up to this one. The room seemed to settle into a deeper kind of stillness, the air thick with expectation, as if even the walls were waiting. "This is the last will and testament of Edward Whitmore," he began, his voice even and measured, each word placed carefully, leaving no space for misinterpretation. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on the document, her lips pressed into a faint smile that suggested she was already hearing what she wanted to hear. Daniel remained still beside her, but I noticed the way his fingers tightened briefly. Against the edge of the table, a small, unconscious movement that spoke louder than anything he had said since we arrived. I sat quietly, my hands folded, my gaze steady, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to. Mr. Collins continued, outlining the formalities, the legal structure, the assets, the properties, each detail presented with the same careful precision, and with each passing sentence, I could feel Vanessa's confidence growing, not in words, but in posture, in the subtle lift of her chin, in the way she exhaled as though tension she had carried was finally being released. It was not until he paused, just briefly, that something shifted. It was a small pause, easily overlooked, but in that silence, there was a change, a subtle realignment of attention that moved away from assumption and toward something else entirely. "There is an additional clause," he said, his tone unchanged but his eyes lifting slightly from the page, not toward Vanessa, not toward Daniel, but toward me. Vanessa's smile faltered for the first time, just enough to register, just enough to reveal that whatever came next had not been part of the version she had already accepted as truth. Daniel turned his head slightly, his gaze moving between Mr. Collins and the document, as if trying to catch up to something that was already unfolding ahead of him. I did not move. I did not react. I simply listened. "Mr. Whitmore included a conditional provision," Mr. Collins continued, his voice steady. "One that applies specifically to the distribution of the estate in relation to his immediate family." Vanessa straightened in her chair, her fingers now still against the surface of the table, the quiet rhythm she had maintained gone, replaced by a focused stillness that carried a different kind of tension. "This provision states that any beneficiary who demonstrates conduct intended to demean, exclude, or undermine Mrs. Margaret Whitmore," he paused again, just long enough for the words to settle, "shall forfeit their claim to any and all assets outlined in this document." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with the realization of what had just been said. Vanessa's expression did not collapse, not immediately, but it changed, the confidence giving way to calculation, as if she were searching for a way to reinterpret what she had just heard into something that still worked. In her favor, Daniel blinked, once, then again, his posture shifting as though the ground beneath him had moved in a way he had not expected. I remained exactly as I was, my hands still, my expression calm, because this was not the moment for reaction, it was the moment for truth to stand on its own. Mr. Collins continued reading, but the room had already changed, the outcome no longer a quiet certainty shaped by assumption, but something else entirely, something that required acknowledgement, whether they were ready to give it or not. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice controlled but edged with something sharper beneath the surface. "That is a very broad interpretation," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked toward Mr. Collins. "Not at me, never at me. I would like clarification on what qualifies as such conduct." Mr. Collins did not rush his response. He closed the folder gently, his gaze steady. "The clause is supported by documented evidence," he said simply. And for the first time since we had entered that room, Vanessa looked at me directly, not with confidence, not with certainty, but with a question she had not yet formed into words. I met her gaze without speaking, because sometimes the most powerful answer is the one that does not need to be explained. Vanessa held my gaze for only a second before looking away, but that second was enough to confirm what I had already understood, that the certainty she had carried into that room was no longer intact, that something had shifted beyond her control, even if she had not yet accepted it. "Documented evidence," she repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of those words, searching for a weakness in them that she could exploit. Mr. Collins did not elaborate immediately, and in that pause, the room seemed to narrow, every detail sharpening, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the subtle hum of the air conditioning, the way Daniel's breathing had become just slightly uneven. I could feel his attention moving now, no longer fixed on Vanessa, but circling, uncertain, as if he were beginning to question something he had not allowed himself to question before. "Would you like me to proceed with the supporting materials?" Mr. Collins asked calmly, directing the question toward Vanessa, though his tone suggested the outcome did not depend on her approval. Vanessa straightened, her composure returning in layers, practiced and deliberate. "Yes," she said, her voice firm, "I would." But there was a difference now, a tightness beneath the control, a carefulness that had not been there before. Mr. Collins reached for a separate folder, thinner than the first, but handled with the same precision. And as he opened it, I felt no urgency, no anticipation, only a quiet acknowledgement that everything was unfolding exactly as it should. "Over the past several months," he began, "Mr. Whitmore took steps to document interactions and decisions that he believed could impact the intent of his estate." Vanessa's fingers curled slightly against the table, not enough to draw attention, but enough for me to notice. Daniel shifted in his seat, turning more fully now, his body no longer angled toward Vanessa, but caught somewhere between us, as though he had not yet decided where he belonged. "These records include written communications, financial requests, and instances of expressed intent regarding the use and control of shared property," Mr. Collins continued, his voice steady, neutral, untouched by the tension building in the room. Vanessa let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though it did not carry any warmth. "I am sure everything can be interpreted in different ways," she said, her tone measured, but her eyes sharper now, focused, calculating. Mr. Collins nodded slightly. "Interpretation is always a factor," he replied, "which is why Mr. Whitmore included clear criteria within the clause." He turned a page, the sound soft but definitive. "Any action intended to marginalize Mrs. Whitmore's role within the household, to limit her access to shared resources, or to reframe ownership without her consent is considered a violation." The words settled into the room with a weight that did not need emphasis. Daniel's hand moved slowly from the edge of the table to his lap, his posture changing in a way that suggested he was beginning to see the shape of something he had not anticipated. Vanessa's expression remained composed, but the ease was gone, replaced by a focus that felt more like defense than confidence. "That is still very subjective," she said, her voice quieter now, but more precise. Mr. Collins closed the second folder gently and looked at her with a calm that did not invite argument. "Not in this case," he said. "There are specific examples." The silence that followed stretched. Longer this time, not because no one knew what to say, but because saying anything would require acknowledging what had already been made clear. I sat there, exactly as I had from the beginning, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my posture unchanged, because this was not a moment I needed to control. It was a moment I had already prepared for. Vanessa glanced at Daniel, expecting something, support perhaps, or confirmation, but he did not respond immediately. His eyes moved briefly toward me, and in that look, I saw something that had been missing until now. Not loyalty, not yet, but awareness, the first quiet step toward understanding that the story he had been following was not the only one being written. And I did not speak, because the truth, once it begins to reveal itself, does not need to be defended, it only needs to be allowed to continue. Vanessa's composure did not break all at once. It shifted in small, controlled adjustments, the kind that might have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching her so closely, if I had not already understood that the confidence she wore so easily was not as unshakable as she believed. "Specific examples," she repeated, her voice steady but lower now, as if she were trying to contain something that was beginning to rise beneath the surface. Mr. Collins inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her without conceding anything, and then he reached for a single sheet within the folder, one that had been placed apart from the others, as though it carried a different kind of weight. "There is a record," he said, "of a conversation regarding the reassignment of property ownership, initiated without Mrs. Whitmore's knowledge." Vanessa's eyes flickered, just briefly, toward Daniel, and in that moment, I saw the first clear sign that she had not expected this to surface. Not here, not like this. Daniel's reaction was slower, more uncertain, his brow tightening as though he were trying to recall something that had not seemed important at the time, something that now refused to remain insignificant. "That was a discussion," Vanessa said quickly, her tone sharpening. Not an action. Mr. Collins did not look at her when he responded. The clause addresses intent as well as action, he said, his voice unchanged, his focus steady. The room seemed smaller then, not physically, but in the way that options began to narrow, in the way that each word removed another layer of assumption Vanessa had relied on. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hand moving to his temple in a gesture that felt less like discomfort and more like recognition, as though pieces were beginning to align in a way he could no longer ignore. There are also documented instances, Mr. Collins continued, of communications suggesting a plan to restructure access to shared accounts and limit Mrs. Whitmore's involvement in financial decisions. Vanessa exhaled, the sound controlled but no longer neutral. That is not uncommon in situations like this, she said, her voice measured. But there was a tightness now, a precision that bordered on defensiveness. We were trying to manage things efficiently. Mr. Collins nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the statement. Efficiency is not in question, he said. Consent is. The word settled heavily, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it had been absent from every conversation that had led to this moment. Daniel's eyes moved toward me again, but this time he did not look away as quickly. There was something different in his expression now, not just uncertainty, but the beginning of understanding, the slow realization that what had been presented to him as practicality might have been something else entirely. Vanessa followed his gaze, and when she looked at me, there was no longer any trace of the easy confidence she had carried into the room. Instead, there was calculation, rapid and precise, as though she were searching for a way to regain control of a situation that was slipping beyond her reach. I think we need to be careful about how these things are interpreted, she said, her voice quieter, but more deliberate, each word placed with intention. Mr. Collins closed the folder in front of him, his hands resting lightly on top of it, his posture unchanged. That is precisely why Mr. Whitmore ensured that interpretation would not be left open, he replied. The silence that followed was not empty. It was decisive, the kind of silence that marks the point where a narrative shifts from possibility to inevitability. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up, this time not at Vanessa, but at the table, at the documents, at the reality that had been placed in front of him without room for avoidance. I remained. Still, my presence steady, not as an interruption, but as a constant, something that could no longer be moved aside or redefined. Vanessa adjusted her posture, straightening slightly, as if reclaiming some part of her composure, but the rhythm had changed, the certainty fractured in ways that could not be restored by confidence alone. And in that moment, as the weight of everything settled into the room, I understood that the outcome had already begun to take shape, not because I had forced it, but because the truth, once given structure, has a way of standing on its own, regardless of who is ready to accept it. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. It was undeniable, like a quiet current that had suddenly turned, pulling everything in a direction no one had prepared for except the one person who had never needed to raise her voice. Vanessa sat straighter now, her shoulders squared, her expression carefully reconstructed into something controlled, but the effort behind it was visible in the way her fingers pressed against the edge of the table, no longer relaxed, no longer rhythmic. If there are specific examples, she said, her tone measured but edged with urgency, then they should be reviewed in full context. Mr. Collins regarded her calmly, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply steady, as though he had anticipated this exact response long before it arrived. Of course, he replied, and he opened the folder once more, this time selecting a document that had been clipped separately, marked with a small tab that suggested it had been referenced more than once. This record includes a written message proposing the reassignment of the primary residence, he said, his voice even, each word placed with precision. Daniel's head lifted slightly at that, his attention sharpening, the words cutting through whatever distance he had been maintaining. Vanessa did not interrupt, but her posture changed again, a stillness settling over her that felt less like control and more like calculation under pressure. Mr. Collins continued. The message outlines a plan to transfer ownership into a new structure, limiting Mrs. Whitmore's authority and redefining her status within the household. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy, not because the words were unclear, but because they were. Daniel turned toward Vanessa fully now, his expression no longer uncertain, but searching, as though he were seeing something for the first time that had been there all along. "Vanessa," he said quietly, not accusatory, not yet, but no longer detached. She met his gaze, and for a brief moment, the composure slipped, just enough to reveal the calculation behind it, the quick adjustment of thought, the search for a version of events that still worked. "We talked about options," she said, her voice steady but tighter than before, "about what would be practical moving forward." Mr. Collins did not look at her as he responded. "The language used in this communication is not exploratory," he said. "It is directive." That single distinction settled into the room with a clarity that did not require emphasis. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, not in relief, but in realization, as if something he had accepted without question was now being reframed in a way he could no longer ignore. I watched him quietly, not with expectation, not with demand, but with the understanding that recognition, when it comes, cannot be forced, it can only be allowed. Vanessa shifted again, her composure tightening into something more rigid, less fluid, as though she were bracing against a current she could not redirect. "Even if that is the case," she said, her voice controlled but sharper now, "it does not change the fact that decisions need to be made." Mr. Collins closed the document and placed it back into the folder with deliberate care. "Decisions have been made," he said, "by Mr. Whitmore." The distinction was clear, final, leaving no space for reinterpretation. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence carried a different weight, not anticipation, but consequence. Daniel looked down at his hands, then back up, his gaze moving briefly toward me before settling somewhere in between, as though he were standing at a point he had not expected to reach. Vanessa did not look at me now, not directly, her focus fixed instead on the documents in front of Mr. Collins, as if the answers she needed might still be found there, if only she could read them differently. I remained still, my presence unchanged, not because I was unaffected, but because this was never about reaction. It was about timing, about allowing the truth to arrive without interruption. And as the weight of everything settled into that room, it became clear that what Vanessa had built so carefully, so confidently, was not unraveling because of anything I had said, but because it had never been as solid as she believed. For a long moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been said, laid out clearly, without accusation, without raised voices, in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Mr. Collins gathered the document slowly, aligning the edges with quiet precision, as if restoring order to something that had already revealed its truth. Vanessa remained still, her posture rigid now, no longer composed but held together by effort, her eyes fixed on the table as though looking up might force her to confront something she was not ready to face. Daniel exhaled quietly, the sound almost unnoticeable, but it carried a weight that had not been there before, the weight of recognition, of understanding that had arrived too late to change what had already been set in motion. I shifted slightly in my chair, not to draw attention, but because the moment had reached its natural end, the kind of end that does not need to be announced. "So what happens now?" Daniel asked finally, his voice lower than before, stripped of the certainty that had once guided it. Mr. Collins looked at him calmly. "The terms of the will stand as written," he said. "Distribution will proceed in accordance with the clause." The words were simple, direct, leaving no ambiguity. Vanessa's hand moved slightly, her fingers pressing against the table as if grounding herself, and when she finally looked up, her expression had changed, not softened, not apologetic, but sharpened in a different way, as though she were recalculating, searching for a path forward that no longer resembled the one she had planned. "This is not over," she said quietly, her voice controlled, but the certainty behind it no longer carried the same weight. Mr. Collins did not respond, because there was nothing to respond to. Some statements are not arguments. They are reflections of something internal, something that does not alter the reality already established. Daniel turned toward her, his expression uncertain, conflicted, caught between what he had believed and what he could no longer ignore. "Vanessa," he said, but whatever he intended to say did not fully form. the words dissolving before they could take shape. I stood then, slowly, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with intention, smoothing my coat as I rose. The same small gesture I had made countless times before, in rooms filled with family, with laughter, with a sense of belonging that now felt distant but not entirely lost. They both looked at me then, truly looked, not past me, not around me, but at me, as though seeing something they had overlooked for far too long. I met their gaze, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity. "I will not be discussing this further today," I said, my voice calm, even, carrying no need for emphasis. It was not a refusal, it was a conclusion. Vanessa's expression tightened slightly, as if she wanted to respond, to reclaim something, but the words did not come. Daniel nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, the first step of many he would need to take if he intended to understand what had just unfolded. I turned toward the door, pausing only briefly as my hand rested on the handle, not out of hesitation, but to allow the moment to settle fully into place. "Your father believed in preparation," I said without turning back. "He also believed that respect should never have to be demanded." The room remained silent behind me, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of consequence, of realization that does not arrive all at once, but stays, lingering, shaping what comes next. I stepped out into the hallway, the air lighter, not because anything had been undone, but because everything had finally been revealed, and as I walked away, I understood something that had taken me far too long to see. That losing someone does not always mean losing everything. Sometimes it means seeing clearly what remains and deciding, with quiet certainty, what is worth keeping.